Sí, sí, probando, probando. 1, 2, 1, 2, probando.
Yeah, or just let them know we're gonna start. I mean, if they're not ready to come in, that's fine, but let's start. Got some music playing or something. It's like too quiet. Why? Do you need to do any kind of introduction, or I'll just jump in when it's as soon as we get agreement? Just go. Like it's live streaming already, right? Yeah. Okay. Okay. I think we're live. Now that Tim and Ed are here, we can get started. All right, I have to stand by the mic. All right, we're going to get back going again with the pedagogical workshop component. El taller pedagógica ya va a empezar. Bueno, I'll introduce myself. I'm Darren Stockdale from the School of Education from the University of Michigan. So welcome back to the symposium for our pedagogical workshop. Bienvenidos de regreso. Yo soy Darren Stockdale, trabajo allá en Michigan, en la Universidad de Michigan, en la Facultad de Educación. Y bienvenidos a ese taller pedagógica. So what we're going to do is I'm going to frame all of the thinking that has happened today in terms of a couple of pedagogical frameworks. And we're going to actually go through a learning activity as if it were a lesson. You're going to be the participants, so you're going to have to do some analysis and some discussion. And then I'll kind of go meta on that and talk about the planning that goes into creating an activity like that. And then there'll be some collaboration and discussion at the end to sort of provide an overview. Entonces voy a proveer como un pequeñito información de teoría pedagógica. Vamos a hacer una actividad de aprendizaje y después vamos a hablar de qué cuesta para planificar una actividad así. All right. So our goals, as suggested already, is to engage in an actual learning activity, and then think about and apply ideas for instructional planning that you guys will use in your own work as you take it to the next step. And we'll begin framing a learning experience around vulnerability and some of the conference themes. Entonces vamos a participar en una actividad de aprendizaje, aprender y aplicar ideas para la planificación de instrucción. Voy a traducir un poquito, pero no todo, y la mayoría de la información en los dispositivos está en español también. So really quickly, when we think about a pedagogical framework, we're thinking about approaches to teaching and learning. And Paulo Freire called the traditional approach the banking model of education, where students are passive recipients of information and the teacher is the depositor of knowledge, right? That's sort of what many of us have experienced in schooling. It's still what is very common in schooling, where the teacher is sort of the sage on the stage. It's a model we want to move away from. So what do we move towards? The model we move towards is problem-posing education, where the teacher is no longer merely the one who teaches, but one who is himself or herself taught in dialogue with the students who in turn, while being taught, also teach. The students no longer docile listeners or critical co-investigators. Los estudiantes que ya no son oyentes dóciles ahora son co-investigadores críticos en el diálogo con el maestro. So it's all about dialogue, co-construction of knowledge. And so that's the kind of lessons that when we're building these lessons and building these education toolkits, we want it to be based on problem-posing education. This is a model called project-based learning that comes out of an organization called PBL Works, and this is their framework. So learning starts with a problem or question. There must be sustained inquiry. It's not a question you can answer quickly. It's got to be authentic, meaning it has real-world value outside the classroom. It's not something that somebody made up just for that moment. It involves student voice and choice, so students have some ability at some certain point in the lesson to choose. There's a process of critique and revision, and there's a public product. So what the students are producing has meaning outside of the walls of the classroom, and it has more importance than just a grade. This is not where we are at in our education system. It is a goal towards which many of us are trying to slowly nudge the system to move in that direction. So the big ideas of PBL, problem-driven learning. It's not topic-driven, right? So immigration is a topic. Why do people move is a problem, or what happens when people move, or what forces push them out is a problem. It's a question. And teaching and learning that emphasize thinking, knowledge construction, not delivery, engagement and dialogue, connection to the world and lived experience, and collaboration in the development of a community. Entonces, el aprendizaje basado en problemas, no basado en temas, tiene aplicaciones en el mundo real, enseñanza y aprendizaje que enfatizan pensamiento, construcción del conocimiento, el diálogo, conexión con el mundo y la experiencia vivida, colaboración y el desarrollo de una comunidad de aprendizaje. So that's kind of what we, as we're thinking about planning instruction, we want to move. This is probably a lot because it's up in English and Spanish, but if you focus on one, don't try to look at both of them. And what we have is this is a similar model. It's an inquiry cycle model, right? So aprendizaje basado en investigación. So we start sort of at the top left side there where we ask a question, and then we find and we analyze information to answer that question. In that process, we're synthesizing evidence and conclusions. We're critically evaluating and revising our claims as we go forward. We share our thinking, we publish, we take action, and then we go back to a new question. This is a disciplinary cycle of inquiry. It's what all of you do in your work, but it's also a framework that we can use to build lessons. Entonces es un modelo, ¿no? de aprendizaje basado en investigación. Empezamos con una pregunta, después tenemos que encontrar y analizar fuentes de información, hay evidencia que tenemos que analizar y sintetizar, estamos evaluando críticamente y revisando, después compartimos, publicamos, tomamos acción, después regresamos a las preguntas, ¿no? Mientras estamos leyendo, escribiendo, hablando, escuchando. So at the same time, in the inner circle, you see the literacy practices where we're reading, we're writing, we're speaking, we're revising, we're listening, all in the service of this inquiry model that we're building, right? Welcome, Alana. Alana got here. Yay. So that's the big picture of our pedagogical framework. I'm not going to go more into frameworks than that, but this is a model of disciplinary work that we want to reproduce in the lessons that we do. So I want to take a moment and just talk about our theme of vulnerability and just make a few key points, or defining, because whenever we're talking about conceptual thematic learning, we need to define our terms. So vulnerability can be the quality or state of being exposed to the possibility of being attacked or harmed, physically or emotionally. That's one definition. It can be a person's openness and willingness to risk being hurt emotionally, as in being willing to love and be loved, or to accept the emotional risks that go with it. It's a very different definition. In disaster relief, it is a specific set of conditions, physical, economic, social, and or attitudinal, which adversely affect a community's ability to prevent, mitigate, prepare for, or respond to a hazard. Entonces hay muchas definiciones para vulnerabilidad, no puedo decir esa palabra, vulnerabilidad, tiene muchas definiciones, y es importante escoger una definición si estamos trabajando con alumnos que ellos entienden, si estamos hablando de calidad de ser abierto, o si es como en desastres naturales, que una comunidad es vulnerable a mucho daño. And definitions matter, right? So, as I already said, vulnerability has many meanings, and it can be confused for weakness, and it's often seen as weakness, but it is not, and it's not the same thing. Vulnerability can be a choice. A person can choose to take a risk and make themselves vulnerable, either physically, emotionally, or socially. And vulnerability can also be imposed by oppressive and unfair systems that marginalize certain individuals, groups, and communities. This is not a choice, and this is the kind that we were talking about mostly today, and is often met with resilience, defiance, and resistance. So we want to be very clear about these different levels and different ways of talking and thinking about vulnerability. Thinking about where vulnerability fits in these different ways in our curriculum. In the language, it could be English language arts, or it could be en español, lenguaje y literatura. It's a theme, vulnerability. Characters make themselves vulnerable and put themselves in vulnerable situations. In civics, as we've talked about in some of the presentations this morning, it can be as a result of policy, can be in connection with social movements. There are historical patterns of inequity, connected community vulnerabilities. In biology and health, we're talking about vulnerability all the time. Think about the coronavirus, who's vulnerable and who's not. Connecting human health and community vulnerabilities. Environmental science, looking at the impacts of climate change. So vulnerability is a cross-curricular concept, and that's why it's really important then to think about how we're defining it in different curricular contexts. And then we want to think about the levels of vulnerability, right? So we can be vulnerable as individuals. We can belong to a family that's in a vulnerable situation. We can belong to a community that's vulnerable, and a region or a whole nation that's vulnerable. So then the question is, how do we teach about vulnerability while also recognizing our students and communities may themselves be vulnerable in different ways, and that there's going to be even different levels of vulnerability in the classroom. And it's just calling that importance out and attending to that. ¿Cómo enseñamos sobre el tema de vulnerabilidad? Por el final ya lo voy a tener. Vulnerabilidad, mientras reconociendo que nuestros estudiantes y comunidades también pueden ser vulnerables en distintas maneras. So just thinking about that is important. And thinking about this dialectical relationship between vulnerability and strength and resistance, and they're sort of this cycle, right? So with that relatively brief introduction, we're going to jump into an activity. And what I'm going to do basically is model what a lesson might look like, or a snapshot of a lesson on taking up this question of vulnerability. So you're going to have to participate and maybe write and talk a little bit and put your student hat on. So the first thing I want to do is just start off with a very brief community builder. And we're small enough that maybe, you could move, well, most of you have met each other, but that's okay. Anyway, so turn to someone near you and introduce yourself. And there's just 3 things. You're going to just take 2 minutes. Where are you from? What interests you about the theme of vulnerability, and what do you hope to learn during the symposium? Just take 2 minutes and talk about these things. Okay, take about 20 seconds and wrap up your conversations. All right, come back. Yeah. Finish up. We're going to come back together. One, two, three, all eyes on. Yeah. Yeah. If you can hear me, clap. Okay. Yeah? Okay, we're going to keep moving. All right. Great. So we've started to build a little community. So the whole point of that is to build a little bit of trust, right? And just obviously if we were working with high school students, we'd spend more time, but we want to build community first. But now we want to get thinking. So we're going to have what's called a brief entry event, un evento de entrada al tema. We're going to use a routine called See, Think, Wonder, ver, pensar y preguntar. So I just want you to look, and then what you're going to do is talk with the people sitting around you very quickly for like 2 minutes, and then you're going to share out with everybody. What do you see? Start with what you see. Don't jump to think. You got to just describe what you see first. Then what does it make you think? And then what questions does it surface for you? Entonces, ¿qué ves? ¿Qué piensas viendo lo que ves? ¿Y qué preguntas están ya surgiendo? So go ahead, take a minute and just talk through this out loud. What do you see? What does it make you think? And what do you wonder? We'll do this for like 2 minutes and then we'll share out. Yeah, don't skip see. What do you see? Okay, let's hear some of your ideas. So let's just call out a couple of people. What do you see? When you look at that, what do you see? Just descriptive language, what do you see? Someone else, yeah. What else do you see? What else? Mm-hmm. Some sort of, yeah, thing. An industrial thing. Some sort of industrial structure. Okay, what does it make you think?
The lower income area.
What makes you think that?
The shabbiness of that house and from what I can see in the other one also, they don't seem
Okay.
like they're kept up all that well,
Okay.
compared to other neighborhoods.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Industrial area is really close to residential area.
Okay, so we have, yeah.
Right, I see an assault to the eyes because of that stark contrast between the house in the foreground and that middle picture.
So this is what you're thinking. It makes you think that this is not pleasant?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. What other thoughts, other sort of analyses that people are making? What are you thinking?
I think being from Michigan, it seems like Detroit.
What questions arise when you look at these pictures? ¿Qué preguntas tienen? Who lives there?
Who made the decision to put the thingy?
Yeah. Who made the decision to put those things so close to each other? ¿Por qué están tan cercanas?
What's being produced there?
Yeah, what's being made? Yeah, what's happening? Mm-hmm.
Do they actually live in the house? Like, does the house have like residents?
Okay, is it occupied? Yeah. Está ocupado.
What's the rest of the neighborhood look like?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what's the cost? What's the rest of the neighborhood look like? Other thoughts, questions? That's good. So we're beginning to analyze a little bit and think about the connections of what it must be like to live in a certain place, right? Which brings us to our driving question for our mini lesson today, which is a version of the question we heard about this morning. Are some people more vulnerable to different problems because of where they live? Si algunas personas son más vulnerables a diferentes problemas debido al lugar donde viven. So that's our driving question, and we're going to dig back into that. We're going to drop down a level, zoom in a little bit to a case study, and we're going to explore, are there communities in and around Detroit, Michigan that are more vulnerable to certain health problems because of their location? And if so, why, and what can we do about it? It's like a three-part question. Are people more vulnerable in this particular area? Why, and what do we do about it? So take another moment and think about what you need to know to be able to answer this question. ¿Qué necesitamos saber a poder responder a esa pregunta allá en la pantalla, right? What do you need to know? Quickly talk, generate some questions. What would you need to know in order to be able to answer that? What do you need to know? ¿Qué necesitamos saber? Okay, all right, I'm going to cut you short. Let's just hear some of your ideas. Call out some of the questions that you have. What do we need to know? And you can even break down the prompt into smaller questions, right? So, are there communities? What communities are, like one of the first questions you might ask, well, what are the communities in and around Detroit, right? That would be one. What are other questions? Other things you identified as what do we need to know?
I'd like to know a set of demographic factors that I can cross-tabulate to see which of
Okay.
the demographic factors like sex or economic status or ethnicity and how they factor into health profiles.
So who lives there and how can we break them down how can we group them in a meaningful way? Yeah. And are there differences across groups? And then differences in what? Yeah. So we even need to begin questioning what do we mean by vulnerable and what do we mean by health problems? All right, so there's a lot of questions. So this is actually an activity you do with students in project-based learning. Oh, go ahead. Liv. So if I were doing this with high school students, I'd be writing all these questions down, and then we would go through an activity where we would actually prioritize the questions and figure out which ones we're actually going to answer. Then the students are answering their own questions that was generated from a larger question. But it's this habit of when you have a learning to how to break down a large question into smaller questions, and then you pursue the smaller questions. So it's about generating need to knows. So that's a practice we want to think about. So now that we've been thinking a little about what we need to know, some of the questions you might ask are, what communities are we talking about? What kinds of health problems? How are these problems seen and measured? And where do we get this information? So sometimes even, if you're coming from an academic lens, you forget you're already asking yourself these questions without even being aware of it. So like pulling back when you're designing something for high school students, you've got, well, what is a health problem? How do I measure a health problem? How would I know if there's a difference? What's my time span? And where do I find the data? Right? So even asking those questions become important. And then asking what is in these communities that might have an impact on health. And we can make a guess because we've seen that picture. And why these communities? Why are those things in these communities? And if there is a problem, what are people doing about it? So those are some of the need to knows too that would eventually emerge from a discussion. So now we're going to begin answering at least a part of that. Does everybody have a handout? There's a little table. I passed a bunch out. There's some up here if you don't have a handout, but everybody should have a little handout. And you want to have the table looking one in front of you. We're going to explore some data snapshots. You want to have that one in front of you. And we're going to do this. What you'll do is you'll quick sort of do your own little analysis and then a quick turn and talk and share. So on each slide, you're going to see things, and I'll do some quick explaining of what's on the slide. And you're just going to describe what you see, and then in the left-hand column, and then on the right-hand column, what information does this give you to help answer the question? So the first is descriptive, the second column is analysis. What can you pull out of it to help you answer the question? And the question again is, are there communities in and around Detroit, Michigan that are more vulnerable to certain health problems because of their location? Okay, clear? And then at the end we'll synthesize. All right, so here we have our first one. So you see there's a little row for slide 26 there. And what you have, first of all, is a map. I'll explain very briefly. You have a map, and on that map it shows you, I'll walk away from the mic. This is Detroit. This is a community called River Rouge, Ecorse, Boynton, and Oakwood Heights. And this is the Marathon Petroleum Refinery, run by Marathon, as in the very large petroleum company. And these are pictures of that. Part of that is the structure that you saw in that other picture. You recognize that? It might be that one, but it's one of these structures. So this is a Marathon. So these pictures, and this is where it's located, right along the Detroit River, in between 75 and 94, sort of south of Detroit and south of Dearborn. But this is southwest Detroit, extends down into here, and then Dearborn is over here. You have a large Latino population, large Arab and Arab American population, and down here a large African American population, and working class white.
Darren, just in case that clicker has a pointer.
Okay, I'll use that in the future. So go ahead and take a minute and just very brief notes, like just a minute. Don't overthink it. Just jot some ideas down. And you're not getting each source is only giving you a partial answer, right? You're not getting, so you're only just jotting down only what it gives you. And now feel free to start sharing just as you're jotting. Kind of process out loud. What do you pull out of this that helps you answer that question? Are there certain communities that are more vulnerable to health problems because of where they are?
And they won the class action lawsuit against it, so it's hard for me to make, something like this, and being able to speculate about whether or not it causes a health problem, because in previous reality, those things are
Okay, we're going to move on. We're going to move on, so if you want to write a final thought, we're going to move to the next one. Okay, so you'll see the same map again. You'll also see in the center, I'm trying to, I don't know if this
You have to turn it on the side.
on this, oh, I see, here we go. Okay. All right, so,
I think the pointer is the one.
there we go. So here's a map of Michigan, and this is Wayne County, and then zooming in, right along here along the river is this part, so we've got the Marathon Oil Refinery. And then here, we have the location of different sulfur dioxide, locations that are emitting sulfur dioxide. So each yellow, red circle is an industrial facility that emits sulfur dioxide. Yellow is bad. This is on some sort of scale that the federal government has. Red is the worst. So we could ask more questions like what is the scale based on, but for now, what we need to know is that yellow's bad and red is really bad. And so each of these dots or little bubbles represents a facility that emits sulfur dioxide. So go ahead, jot some notes down. Talk about it while you're jotting if you want. And you see this little island here is this little island here, right? So you see sort of the geographic overlap. Mm-hmm. Okay. So you've jotted down some overall impressions. Kind of keep these maps in your mind. Okay. Now we have some more complex images here, and I'll just briefly explain. You can read the titles barely, but this map, sorry. All right. The larger map here, this is a demographic map, right? So the red areas are 80% people of color or more. So it's primarily African American, but down here it would be Latinx people as well. So people of color are, the more red an area it is, the higher the percentage of people of color. Yellow is pretty much a white area. That's this one. This one over here is levels of industrial and air contamination. So the more red it is, the more industrial the land use is, and the more the higher levels of air contamination. And then over here, you have the deeper the red, the higher the level of vulnerability or risk for respiratory problems and cancer. So here we have industry and air contamination, respiratory problems, typically asthma and emphysema, and cancer risk, and here, people of color. So note the patterns, talk about it with the people nearby you. What are you seeing? How does this help you answer your question? Are certain people in certain communities more vulnerable to health problems because of where they live?
I see less of a relationship between the color versus industrial plants, but then when we get to health stuff, it does mesh together. So like industrial plants are more related to sort of health problems, less
Okay, so pause your conversations. Going to go to one more, or two more. But if we could add a fourth map, what map would you want to add? What are we missing? What was that? Sure, access to healthcare. Something more basic demographic. What would be helpful? Income level. Household income. Or if we could have a similar demographic map based on socioeconomic status, because then you could cross-reference it, because it's not as if the air contamination doesn't affect the working class white people that work here, right? Yeah.
There's also not just socioeconomic status, but also will have health insurance.
Mm-hmm.
Those are interesting.
Yeah.
Because you then,
Yep.
depending on
Mm-hmm.
socioeconomic
Mm-hmm.
status, they or may not have
Mm-hmm.
health insurance or that.
Yeah. So what we might do is, if we were teaching this, is have a list of ongoing questions we want to add to our list. What's the health insurance rate? How does this impact, how would this look if we had a map for socioeconomic status? And beginning to think about all these other factors that come into play. So here's some text now. We're going to a different type of source. In 2008, the Michigan Department of Community Health coined Detroit the epicenter of the asthma burden in Michigan. The prevalence of asthma among adults in Detroit was 50% higher than the statewide average. Likewise, rates of asthma hospitalization in Detroit were found to be 3 times higher than that of Michigan, and rates of asthma death over 2 times higher compared to the overall state numbers. Schools located in areas with the highest air pollution levels had the lowest attendance rate and the highest proportion of students meeting state educational testing standards. So what does this add to your ability to answer? So jot some notes down, talk about it quickly. What can you pull out from this that adds to your understanding and your ability to answer the question? Okay. Final source coming up. If you want to jot something down, jot it down. So you're going to have to reproduce something in a minute, so you better be taking notes. You're going to get graded on this. So here we have a smaller scale sample of N of 1, right? Like many of her neighbors, Miss Smith is the woman in the picture on the left. Smith wants to escape the toxic environment, but on a fixed income, it's next to impossible. It's hard enough trying to sell a modest house in the shadow of Marathon. So this is in that same neighborhood that we're talking about. 2 of Smith's husbands have chronic respiratory problems, and her husband relies on a breathing device. His breathing is getting worse, and he has to take medicine to breathe. He feels trapped. In 2012, Marathon offered above-market prices to buy homes in the mostly white neighborhood of Oakwood Heights in northern 48217 to make way for an expansion. But the same offer wasn't extended to Boynton, the predominantly black neighborhood in the southern 48217. So the question we might pose is this personal story representative of the patterns that we've seen in the larger data, even though we've only seen quick data snapshots? And if so, does that make it a more reliable snapshot? Again, an N of 1, but does it represent larger case studies? So go ahead, take a moment, talk about this. How does this help you answer the question? Does it add depth, particularly the part at the end, does that add depth to our understanding of why some people are more vulnerable than others? Okay, so your final task now for our little activity, flip your paper over. Normally I would do this on 2 separate sheets so you could look across them, but to save paper, we went this way. And you can just talk about this in small groups, and then we'll do it together as a large group. But the question is, based on what you just saw, using your notes and using bits and pieces of information from each of those data snapshots that you had, how would you complete this? What is a claim you might make to answer the question? Are there communities in and around Detroit that are more vulnerable? Because of the, and the why part, I should have added the why part on there, because this could just be a yes or no question. Don't put yes or no. Make a full statement. A claim, and then like in a sentence form, and then what evidence do you have to support that claim? And then reasoning is different than evidence. Evidence is like a listing of the facts, and the reasoning is your explanation of those facts. So like evidence might just be a bullet point, and then reasoning becomes a list of statements where you're saying, this evidence shows, I know that this shows a pattern because it's almost like an if-then statement. If these things are happening, then this is what it means. So go ahead and take a few minutes and just talk about that. Feel free to jot if you want. But what's a claim that you could make that answers this question based on the limited evidence that you have? What is the evidence in brief form, and what's the reasoning you would wrap around it? How do these facts show this pattern? Okay, let's just hear some of your ideas now out for the whole group. Go ahead. Let's start with this little group over here. You guys had a good conversation. What are you talking about? What are you thinking? I'm gonna pick on you.
I think we had similar, perhaps different versions of this, that communities of color in Detroit are disproportionately impacted by environmental hazards. Some evidence that could be used to support that includes the demographic map that included information about race, the map of both the locations of the structures, but also the map about pollution rates in the different areas.
So that pulled evidence from several of the different sources. Anybody want to add anything? Have something significantly different or a different idea that you would want to add? That was a good, well done. Yeah, go ahead.
We also talked a bit about the reproduction of poverty
Oh,
from the slide about school outcomes, and then also the anecdotal evidence from the last article about the woman
That's great.
talking about her son's health problems, and so
Nice.
into kind of immobility, like not just what this looks like right now,
Yeah.
but
It's a really good connection.
yeah, generational problem.
Right, absolutely. So what we would do then is go through and flesh this out more if we had more time, right? And start building out some real, maybe some deeper, some more analytical graphic organizers or something. But so it raises the question, we haven't fully answered our question yet, right? Because our question was, are there differences? Are certain people more vulnerable than others? If so, why? And what do we do about it? Because if we were studying with high school students, we wouldn't want to just leave it at the problem. We need to end up in some sort of transformative action where there's something you can do about it. Because the world is depressing enough as it is. We don't want to leave them in a hopeless state. But we also need to go back and figure out why. So what we might do is explore another data set and look at some more data. Now this is a lot of complex stuff up here, but I'll talk through it real quick. Let me just give you a little background. This map up here shows, it's called the racial dot map. It's an interactive map of the United States. It's available online. It's really, really a cool tool based on 2010 census data, so it's changed a bit since then. But this is the Detroit metropolitan area. Each dot represents one person. Each green dot represents an African American person. Blue is white. Yellowish, or this brown is Latinx. Red is Asian. Of course, it's based on census racial categories, which are hugely problematic. For instance, it shows Dearborn as white because, as of yet, there's no census category for Arab American or North African people, although the MENA debate is still ongoing, right? So it misrepresents diversity in some ways. But what do you think this line is here, those of you who know the region? 8 Mile, that's 8 Mile. Look how, and if you know the region really well, where there's a little square that is Inkster, which is a black community surrounded by working class white communities, and it is literally a square, and it's a green square. It's really stark because that was a community established by Ford for their African American workers because the white workers didn't want to live in the same community back in, like, I don't know, 1920s, 1930s-ish. So this is 2010 segregation. This is a housing map of the area from 1936, put out by Hulk, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, during the New Deal. It's a federal. This is based on federal policy, and this is where the term redlining comes from. Green areas are suitable for white, are meant to be white neighborhoods. Blue is mostly white, but next to black or immigrant communities. Yellow are kind of mixed, immigrant communities, a little bit less white in 1936. And then red is people of color, primarily African American. And this is based on this is to set home valuation. So if your home resided in a particular area, it got a higher value if it was in a green area, a little bit lower if it was in a blue area, lower still if it was in yellow, and if it was in a red area, it was valued at even less, meaning you couldn't get a home loan for a certain amount to move out or whatever, basically, right? So it's based on home values, but that affected bank loans, and that was sort of the intent, was to build that. So what you would do with students, of course, would be to analyze these patterns and see how did what happened in 1936 set us up for racial segregation in 2010, and now again in 2020. We'll get a new map in 2020. It will have changed a little bit, but it won't have changed that much. Like Midtown will be more blue in Detroit, but it won't have changed that much. So that would be one piece of data that we would do a similar, or a couple pieces of data we'd do a similar exercise with. What does this pattern tell us? What are we seeing? Here's another piece. So this is from the underwriting manual. That the map was connected to this manual, and you see this is giving instructions to people who are doing home value underwriting and mortgage underwriting, right? So their instructions were that the valuator should investigate areas surrounding the location of a given property to determine whether or not incompatible racial and social groups are present. To that end, an intelligent prediction may be made regarding the possibility or probability of the location being invaded by such groups. If a neighborhood is to retain stability, it is necessary that property shall continue to be occupied by the same social and racial classes. A change in social or racial occupancy leads to instability and a reduction in values. It's federal policy, 1936. During the New Deal, right? So this is when when there's tons of people who are trying to get back on their feet, and so the government is basically giving out this massive program of support to help people get back into housing, but institutionalizing segregation at the federal level. This is a document from 1952 from Shelby Township. It's a section from a deed of a home, and it says that this, and it's about the piece of land and all the property on it, shall not be sold to, rented to, or occupied by any person of Negro blood, and also not be used for raising pigs, glue factory, or other dangerous or offensive purposes. 1952. There are still properties that haven't been sold that have these clauses on the books in Michigan. So these still exist. But it was very common to have that kind of clause written outside, especially in Oakland and Macomb and Monroe County outside of Detroit. That language was commonly built in. So what we see and what the chain of reasoning that you can create from this is that racist policies in the past led to segregated communities. It would take a little bit more work and a little bit more data to get here, but these are the understandings that students would generate through data analysis. Communities of color then trapped in these communities had fewer resources and less political power. Corporations like Marathon and DTE take advantage of this inequality and locate their more hazardous facilities in these communities. And then those heavy industries poison the air and cause health problems at greater rates in those communities. And people, because of the institutionalized inequality, can't move out or have a more difficult, now they can theoretically, but it's much more difficult. This would be compounded by multiple other variables like access to health care, access to health insurance, right? But so basically we begin crafting this narrative that answers the question, yeah, where we live matters and people are more vulnerable to certain problems because of where they live. And students would be creating this themselves and pulling this out of the data that we curate and select for them. Or you could just go the textbook version, which would be give them an article that tells them people are more vulnerable, but that's no fun, and they don't learn to think or analyze, right? So the next steps would be exploring social movements and community organizing in response to these issues, looking at both historical and contemporary examples of people pushing back on this. There's a ton of environmental community organizing in these neighborhoods where people have organized. They haven't been super successful because Marathon is an extremely powerful company. DTE is extremely powerful. But there's ongoing activism as we speak, and it's been going on and on for years. And then students might develop an action plan or a communication plan, even developing educational brochures or just doing something to raise awareness of the problem is better than not taking action at all. Or they might write letters, they might learn about organizations, bring in a guest speaker. So I want to take a moment and go meta, because the whole point of that exercise is to help you begin to envision what the lessons that you create might look like in some ways, even though the content may be different. So the phase, the thinking, right? You start off, you frame out a problem driven by your work. Then you move to thinking about what are my learning objectives or outcomes? What do I want people to take out of this? How are they going to communicate? What's the final product going to be? Then you have to develop, you don't develop the activities until you get here, you develop your analysis activities, and then you figure out how they're going to process and share. So just kind of walk you through that really quickly. So planning, the first thing that we did is I just said talk amongst yourselves and get to know each other really quickly. We would spend more time, but the first thing if we're talking about vulnerability is make sure that students aren't vulnerable in our classroom while they're learning about vulnerability. We've already had some good examples of that today, right? So planning for a safe and productive learning community. Then we get into problem framing and question generation. What is the question that students are going to pursue? What are the learning outcomes? How are they going to communicate that? I want to think about those things first before I plan the activity. I want to have a destination in mind before I plan out my route, right? I got to select the data, the sources, and the texts. Then I design my activity. How am I going to introduce this? What's the analysis work going to involve? How are kids going to collaborate in the process? And what feedback are they going to get? And how am I going to assess their learning? So the first thing, again, just walk you through the steps. Community building in the classroom is about creating a safe space. There's a ton of strategies and ways to do that. We don't have time to really get much in detail on that right now. But it's also about making a classroom the place where it's about questions and not answers. So in a typical classroom, students don't speak up because they don't know the answer. And they know that the 3 smart kids are going to give the right answer if they wait long enough, right? So we want to disrupt that dynamic and make it about the question, because everybody can come up with a question. Everybody can say, I don't understand, or I don't know. And it's actually harder for the really accelerated kids sometimes to participate that way, because they don't like to say, I don't know, or I don't understand. But with support, they can learn how to say it. It's a valuable lesson. So then in your cases and in this case, we actually start with actual research, right? I didn't just make that up. There's tons of research. So here's an example of a study: air pollution and respiratory symptoms among children with asthma, vulnerability by corticosteroid use in residence area. I'm not going to give that to high school students. It's pretty complex and dense. They're looking at ambient particulate matter and ozone, respiratory symptoms. They're basically answering the same question that we answered, but I'm gonna shift and turn that into a better question for investigation in that context. So what is a good question? A good question is open-ended and thought-provoking. It's meaningful and purposeful. It's emotionally engaging. You can actually research it and connect it to ideas and concepts, and it's conducive to collaboration and discussion. So when you're thinking about how to turn your work into start with that good question or that problem statement and think about these things. So kind of the process I went through is I started with this research statement: air pollution and respiratory symptoms among children with asthma, vulnerability by corticosteroid use in residence area, and just zoomed out, right? And I zoomed out to, are there communities in and around Detroit that are more vulnerable to certain health problems? If so, why, and what do we do about it? And we could zoom out another level, because Enid this morning did it at the level of Puerto Rico, right? And what's cool about the question then is it can be asked about different people in different times in different places. It is an enduring, what we call an enduring question. It's a question that doesn't go away. Does where we matter live? Does where we live make us more vulnerable to certain things? You can ask that about any region at any time, right? And so it's this enduring question that just keeps popping back up. So it creates a good case study. So then Detroit's a case study, Puerto Rico's a case study, Morocco's a case study, right? So I've established my problem space now, and I've begun playing around with my problem. I want to think about learning outcomes. So if we want to think about learning, specifically in learning objectives, they should be specific and measurable, right? You want to actually be able to see it in action and be able to measure it. So don't say like students will understand, because how do you measure understanding? You've got to be able to see. So I want to use slightly more active verbs. All right, so students will be able to generate and communicate an evidence-based answer to the larger question using the case study of communities in and around Detroit. And so I've got my little graphic organizer that this is how I'm going to make that visible. They got to have a claim, evidence, and some reasoning. I'm going to have to teach them what a claim is. I'm going to have to teach them what evidence is and how to generate reasoning. But that's the format I want them to take. And then students will be able to analyze and synthesize information across multiple sources. So when I look at their graphic organizers, I'm going to make sure, did they actually analyze and synthesize? Did they include information? Are they just repeating stuff, or are they thinking about it? And did they pull information from multiple sources to generate a conclusion? Is there evidence of synthesis? So I can begin, those aren't perfect, but they're sort of good working objectives. So I've done that. Now I want to think about, so a graphic organizer is great, a little table like that, but maybe I want something a little bit more engaging and comprehensive, right? So that might be my scaffold or my support that helps them create an essay, a brochure, a multimedia presentation, a political action campaign, a podcast. There's any number of things that students could create to communicate what they've learned, to communicate their evidence-based answer. And this graphic organizer might just be a step in the way. So that's one thing I would think about. What are they actually going to produce? So really quickly then, Oh, let me just go back. So, no, I think actually I'm in good shape now. I sped things up, which is good. So now we're going to move into the discussion. Any questions on all that before we go on? Let me give you time to process and talk now. Does that make sense? That's kind of the process and the thinking, and I'll give you a couple of handouts in a moment while you're talking that help you begin thinking about these steps in a more concrete way. But problem framing and data selection, and then we didn't even get into the analysis stuff, like how do you structure text analysis. We'll do that part tomorrow. All right, so for now, turn and talk. What are the challenges? And this is open. Talk about any of the presentations today, not just what I just shared, but both panels, the examples that were shared. So talk about what challenges might arise when teaching young people about any of these things, and think about challenges of their own vulnerability. Think about challenges of complexity. Think about challenges of background knowledge. Like, what do you need to know to be able to do this and to be able to think about this problem? Like, can you analyze climate change in Morocco if you can't find Morocco on a map, right? So the solution isn't to not learn about Morocco. The solution is first learn about where it is on a map and get a little background knowledge, and then we dive in. So talk about things like that. What are the challenges that any of these examples, and how might we prepare students and teachers? And then also just add to that quick processing. What was surprising? Did any of the panels sort of connect to what you already thought about a topic, extend it, or challenge it? You're thinking about vulnerability. Connect, extend, challenge. And of those of you who are teaching classes, connect, extend, challenge is a great prompt. Anytime they read anything and you need a discussion, how does this connect to what you think about this problem? How does it extend it? How does it challenge it? It's a visible thinking routine. So go ahead, talk for a few minutes, and then we'll come back together and wrap up. gonna take the handheld mic and pass it around. So, what do you think? What did you talk about? Let's just hear some highlights of conversations. I want to hear from, I'm going to put Alvita on the spot, because I want to hear what you were saying about, I heard something about race and issues of privilege and marginalization, so I would like to hear about that conversation, and I think other people would too.
So I was thinking in particular about Leah, right? The activity that you brought up about having students imagine that they are families considering migration and like the conditions they'd have to be deciding whether to stay, whether to go, and what to do. And I was just sharing some of my experiences in the classroom in predominantly white classrooms, where sometimes when you're dealing with these difficult issues and you're asking white students to imagine what it would be like to be marginalized, a lot of emotions come up that, especially for me as a woman of color, are strange to manage, because then suddenly your classroom has become a space where your privileged white students are upset about having to imagine things that other people have to live through all the time. And so it's just a challenge that I have thought a lot about, and I think it's made me shy away from doing those kinds of activities, because frankly I don't like when the classroom turns that way and we're comforting white people that feel bad about things white people have done. And it's a challenge that I still face. So I don't have an answer to it, but it was something that I have been thinking about as we're thinking about, because you want people to have empathy, you want them to be able to put themselves in somebody else's shoes, but is there a possibility of re-traumatizing other students in the class who have actually, they may have lived through this, and then they're watching people who are like in tears just imagining what it would be like. So yeah, that's what I was thinking about.
Anybody want to respond to that?
Well, kind of gonna want to add like the reactions of the white students if we were to teach this in the classroom. So another thing we discussed is we have to make sure that like they do not skip each step of introducing the evidence of the kind of claim, because what I imagine is if I teach this in my own section, people say that like, oh, so you want to say that racial discrimination is a bad thing. But actually, we are talking about like kind of logical steps to prove like how racism will make a structure to make certain groups vulnerable, like medically, health-wise, and DTE taking advantage of that kind of perception that they buy out, the white neighborhood with like higher prices and paying lower for the black neighborhood, so that people get trapped and becoming immobile. So it's kind of pretty much complex process. So we have to make sure the student have to go through each steps rather than jumping into the conclusion.
Yeah, so the trick is, teaching about this stuff is really hard, and there are ways to do it well, but many teachers aren't prepared. So, we worry about this in a project that we work on. It's called Equitable Futures, where we're teaching about some of the stuff that we saw and have had we've given materials at times to teachers who weren't prepared to teach it and are worried that harm is actually done to kids and they're made to feel marginalized or isolated in the classroom. So there's no easy answer, right? It's super tricky. But building off of what Cooney said, if you can go back and create these it's about the evidence, and then also giving teachers some talking tools around how to talk about empathy and not sympathy, how to talk about and build like a safe classroom climate, and then also giving teachers the tools to kind of put that in check and say, you know what, this is not about you right now, we're talking about people's lived experiences, and you can, but that's a trick, it's hard to do. So, but yeah, so this is a constant back and forth, because then do you not do it? Or, so I think there's a step back you can take where it's almost gives them less agency to feel that way. Yeah, to create an activity where they might feel that way later on, but in the classroom it's about analyzing the evidence and generating some claims that the data clearly show these things, right? So, yeah, other thoughts, other things you guys talked about?
I think just continuing on that conversation, the community building activities would be really important too. and not just at the beginning of your activity, but if you're teaching a semester long or quarter long course, building that throughout the time that you spend with your students. That's something that I haven't thought about doing before, but I think it would be really important to create an environment where people feel vulnerable and willing to take a risk and to challenge themselves. Because I do find students kind of shut down for me as well, talking about some of these topics. And then also I find that some privileged students rely on other people to answer questions so that they don't have to really engage. So it would be important to build, yeah, just an environment for people to be willing to put themselves out there.
We have these activities we talk about learning edge. There's the concept of being on your learning edge. There's your comfort zone, learning edge, and then panic zone. It's like concentric circles. Panic zone, you start shutting down and you're not processing. Learning edge is actually where you're starting to feel a little bit uncomfortable and maybe your heart's beating a little bit faster, but you're actually engaged. And then comfort zone, you're not learning as much. So it's about getting people right in that spot where they're uncomfortable enough but haven't shut down yet.
And I think the challenge to that, Darren, is, and this, I think it's back to Elvita's point too, is, and also something you mentioned in your talk, is that there are going to be different levels of vulnerability within a single classroom, especially if we're talking about multicultural and multilingual classrooms. Then it places greater onus on the teacher to meet all of those different students at multiple different levels. And to Esma's point about how you build and facilitate trust in a classroom, and it's not just a box that you check, but something that happens over the course of a class or a school year. All that's going to be very context specific in terms of the kind of course that's being taught. Are they middle schoolers? Is it a group of students that have a homeroom together but take classes with other students throughout the day? Is it university students who come together for section once a week but may study with their peers that look like them but maybe not the people that are in the same section? So identifying what trust and safety looks like in the classroom is really important, and is something that is distinct depending on the educational context.
I mean, it's kind of piggybacking on all these ideas about not creating vulnerability when you're teaching about vulnerability. I forget what I was gonna say. So about the learning edge, where like you don't want people to be too uncomfortable, but you do want them to be uncomfortable. I think like the workshop we have today is also kind of like finding that learning edge too, because in a sense it is kind of removed from like the immediate, right? Like by like teaching about different regions, but something that you can relate to kind of makes it less vulnerable and kind of safer, but then also it also awakens a critical consciousness of students to be able to on their own apply. And Juan was talking about how, you know, sometimes the most you can do as a teacher is to tell a student or let them know about gentrification so that they can look for solutions later or talk about it in different ways. So I think that's like another added value, because I was thinking about this professor that I GSI'd for, and she taught about ethnic diversity in Japan. But, you know, most students, like, it kind of met the race and ethnic requirement for undergrads. Yeah, but why? Like, you're learning about Japan, but so much of like kind of the ethnic diversity and racism and discrimination that we talked about, like you can very easily make connections to kind of your own society. So,
Yeah, so like building a set of norms becomes really, really important. And so if it's hard to do that. Like, and the thing that we'll end up creating is like this education toolkit. We have to make a lot of assumptions. Like, we're assuming and hoping that a teacher will have done norming with their students and prepared them. So typically in the introduction to like the toolkit, there'll be something like, we hope you've taken the time to build a positive classroom climate, because some of these issues can be difficult. But when you're building curriculum, it's really hard because you have to hope that these things happen. So we can, as you go forward, because like, for instance, Ozma's topic, super intense and potentially really alienating for like super patriotic students in the United States who like can't deal with the fact that the United States government may have tortured people and like aren't ready to hear that, but it happened, right? So it's like it's our responsibility to put that out there into the world. And if they're not ready to hear it, they still need to hear it. But that's really difficult to negotiate. Fortunately, we're just writing the lessons. We don't have to teach it. No, I'm just kidding. But we build in the language. No, but you build in the language like this is a difficult topic, and some students might not be ready to hear this. Here's how you answer that. It goes back to we're analyzing data. This is data. We're not making this up. This isn't like a story. There's tons of evidence that shows that this happened. And there are people in positions of power who admitted it happened and then justified it. So what we're questioning is not whether or not it happened, but whether or not you're okay with their justification. Hopefully students aren't, but we can't do that thinking for them. But so like engaging them in these questions, it's super important. It's a responsibility. So you just have to hope for a really good teacher. But seriously, building in like that introductory language and building in some norm setting and some rules in a sense and suggested norms for a lesson. Like what are the things that teachers should be aware of and thinking about. So each lesson will have like teacher preparation notes. So be thinking about the things that you want teachers thinking about ahead of time and sort of the background reading. So even some of the reading that you guys do that might not be appropriate for high school students might be really appropriate for teachers to read because they should know, like we can suggest, like read this article. If you're going to teach this lesson, make sure you know the context. So read this article first, please. So thinking about those things, we'll do as best we can to set teachers up to deal with those issues. And that's as good as we can do. But it's super important stuff to get them thinking about that. Just want to show you the next step, which we're not actually going to do, but I'm going to give it to you as unofficial homework. It's not homework, it's thinking. So basically, the next task, and you can actually do this when you go home or on the plane or whatever, keep that day one worksheet because that's sort of your next step in creating your lesson. After you've been thinking, after the panels tomorrow, we'll do a little bit more of this conversation tomorrow in the afternoon. I'll get a little more specific in like how do you plan a text-based activity and things like that, and then give you some time to think and brainstorm. But review those questions and think about in the context of your presentation or whatever you're teaching, how would you answer those questions? What are the things? It's just a thinking exercise to get started on. And then we'll share out a little bit at the end of the day tomorrow about our teaching ideas. There's some time built in to do that and get some more feedback. Any final thoughts or questions we'll take? Gabrielle's going to pick us up in like 10, 15 minutes, so there'll be time to go to the restroom or whatever, pack yourself up. And Karen, you want a quick announcement?
Sure. Could you please fill these out and give them to me? I don't need your names on them. They're confidential. Sarah will enter the data, and the idea is to give some helpful feedback, both in terms of how useful this was, but also what could be done to strengthen this workshop for future times. Thank you.
Okay, so we'll take the last few minutes to do that, and then we'll kind of start gathering our goods and head on out to find Gabrielle.